Robert William Pickton was a pig farmer. He lived in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, Canada. His farm was a messy, sprawling place. It was located not far from the busy city of Vancouver. Robert, often called Willie by those who knew him, grew up on this farm. He inherited it with his brother, Dave Pickton, and his sister, Linda. The Pickton family had owned the land for many years. They raised pigs and sold pork, but the farm held dark secrets, unknown to most people who passed by or even did business there. It looked like any other rundown farm, perhaps a bit more cluttered than most. Robert Pickton was a quiet man. He often seemed shy or socially awkward. He was not someone who stood out in the crowd. He had few close friends. He spent most of his time on the farms. He worked with the pigs. He also ran a side business with his brother. They had a salvage company. This meant they collected and sold scrap metal and old vehicles. The farm was littered with junked cars, broken machinery, and piles of debris. This clutter provided many hiding places. It also made the farm look even more derelict. The Pickton brothers were known in the community. They hosted large parties at the barn on their property. This barn was converted into a makeshift party palace called Piggy's Palace. These parties were wild affairs. They attracted many people, including bikers and individuals from Vancouver's rougher neighborhoods. There was often drinking, drug use, and loud music. These events were registered as a non-profit society called the Piggy's Palace Good Time Society. This allowed them to operate somewhat outside the usual rules for bars or clubs. Beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary, if somewhat eccentric life, Pickton was hiding a monstrous secret. He was not just a pig farmer. He was not just a party host. He was a predator. He used his farm as his hunting ground and his graveyard. The isolation of the farm, its sheer size and its neglected state, made it an ideal place to commit terrible crimes. For years, he operated without drawing serious attention from the authorities. His quiet demeanor and the chaotic nature of his property helped to conceal his evil acts. Vancouver's downtown Eastside, often called the DTES, is a neighborhood known for its poverty. It is also known for high rates of drug addiction and homelessness. For many years, it has been a place where vulnerable people struggle to survive. Among these were many women. Some were indigenous. Many were involved in sex work to support themselves or their addiction. They lived on the margins of society. Their lives were often difficult and dangerous. They faced violence and exploitation regularly. These women were daughters, sisters, and mothers. Starting in the late 1980s and continuing through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, women began to disappear from the downtown East Side. At first, the disappearances were not widely noticed, or if they were noticed by friends and family, they were not taken seriously by the authorities. These women often had transient lifestyles. They might move without telling anyone. They might leave town for a while. So, when one went missing, it was easy for some to assume she had simply moved on. The police were slow to connect the cases. The numbers, however, began to grow. One woman, then another, then another. Families reported their loved ones missing. Friends worried. Advocates for sex workers and indigenous women started to raise alarms. They saw a pattern. They believed something terrible was happening to these women. They suspected a serial killer might be targeting them. The downtown East Side was a place where many people felt forgotten. The women who went missing were among the most forgotten of all. Their voices were not easily heard by those in power. The missing women were often struggling with immense challenges. Addiction made them vulnerable. Poverty forced them into dangerous situations. Many had experienced trauma throughout their lives. Because of who they were and where they came from, society often judged them harshly. This judgment made it harder for them to get help. It also meant that when they vanished, the official response was often inadequate. The disappearances created an atmosphere of fear and distrust in the downtown East Side. Women knew they were in danger, but few seemed to be listening to their fears. As more women disappeared from the downtown East Side, concern grew within the community. Family members and support workers pleaded with the Vancouver Police Department. They asked for a serious investigation. They feared a predator was targeting the most vulnerable women in the city. However, the official response was slow and often dismissive. Police officials initially denied that a serial killer might be at work. They suggested the women had simply moved away or had died of drug overdoses. This lack of immediate concerted action frustrated and angered those who knew the missing women. There were early clues and warnings that pointed towards Robert Pickton. As early as 1997, Pickton was charged with the attempted murder of a sex worker. The woman, Wendy Lynn Eistether, had escaped from his farm after he attacked her. She told police he had handcuffed her and tried to kill her. She managed to stab him and flee. The charges against Pickton were later dropped. This was because the victim was considered an unreliable witness due to her drug addiction. This decision would prove to be a tragic missed opportunity. Pickton remained free to continue his crimes. Friends of missing women also reported suspicions about Pickton. Some women had told friends they were going to a party at the pig farm in Port Coquitlam. Then, they were never seen again. Bill Hiscox, a former employee of Pickton's, told the police in 1998 that he believed Pickton was responsible for the disappearances. He said he had seen women's purses and identification on the farm. He also recounted a disturbing conversation where Pickton's friend Lynn Ellingson said she saw Pickton butchering a woman in his barn. Police interviewed Pickton but did not search his farm thoroughly at that time. The official police task force to investigate the missing women was not formed until much later. The Vancouver Police Department and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, sometimes struggled to coordinate their efforts. There was disagreement about the nature of the problem. There was also a lack of resources dedicated to these cases in the early years. The victims were largely marginalized. This societal indifference seemed to be reflected in the initial police response. For years, the families of the missing women lived with anguish and uncertainty, feeling their cries for help were largely ignored. Years passed with little progress in the missing women investigation. The number of women vanishing from the downtown Eastside continued to climb. Families and activists kept up the pressure. They held rallies and vigils. They demanded answers and action. The police by now had a joint task force, Project Even-Handed, looking into the disappearances. They had a list of potential suspects, including Robert Pickton. However, they lacked the concrete evidence needed to make an arrest or conduct a major search of his property. His farm remained largely unexamined. The critical break in the case finally came in early 2002. It was not directly related to the missing women investigation at first. Instead, it involved an unrelated firearms complaint. A former employee of Pickton's, Scott Chubb, told the RCMP that Pickton had illegal guns on his farm. This information was considered credible enough to obtain a search warrant. On February 5, 2002, RCMP officers went to the Pickton farm in Port Coquitlam. Their primary goal was to search for illegal firearms. They had no idea what horrors they were about to uncover. As police officers began their search for weapons, they started to notice suspicious items. In Pickton's messy trailer home on the farm, they found items belonging to some of the missing women. They discovered an asthma inhaler prescribed to Serena Abbotsway. She was one of the women who had vanished from the downtown Eastside. They also found other personal effects that seemed out of place. These discoveries immediately raised red flags. The focus of the police presence on the farm shifted dramatically. This was no longer just about illegal guns. The initial findings were shocking enough to warrant a much larger investigation. The RCMP quickly secured the farm. They realized they might be on the verge of solving the mystery of Vancouver's missing women. Robert Pickton was arrested on firearms charges on February 6, 2002. But the police knew this was just the beginning. The true scale of what happened on that pig farm was yet to be revealed. The search for guns had unexpectedly opened the door to a far more terrifying reality. The years of waiting for answers were about to end in a gruesome way. Once police realized the Pickton farm could be connected to the missing women, a massive forensic investigation began. The farm was declared a major crime scene. It became one of the largest and most complex crime scenes in Canadian history. Teams of forensic experts, archaeologists, and anthropologists were brought in. They faced a daunting task. The farm was vast and filled with junk, dilapidated buildings, and muddy fields. The search would take many months, eventually stretching into years. Every inch of the property had to be meticulously examined. The investigators used heavy machinery to dig through the soil. They sifted through tons of earth. They searched the barns, the slaughterhouse, the outbuildings, and Pickton's own residence. What they found was beyond anyone's worst nightmares. They discovered human remains. These remains were often fragmented and mixed with animal bones. This made identification extremely difficult. They found DNA belonging to many different women. The evidence painted a chilling picture of what had occurred on the farm. Inside a freezer in Pickton's workshop, investigators made a particularly grim discovery. They found 2 halves of a human head. They also found hands and feet. These remains were later identified as belonging to 2 of the missing women. Personal items of the victims were scattered across the property. Jewelry, clothing, and identification cards were unearthed. These items linked more and more missing women to the farm. The sheer volume of evidence was overwhelming. The farm was not just a place of murder, it was a place of systematic disposal. The search also extended to the pigs themselves. There were horrifying indications that Pickton may have fed human remains to his pigs. This was one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. It explained why so little physical evidence of some victims was ever found. The investigation required immense resources and expertise. The conditions were often unpleasant and emotionally taxing for the investigators. Day after day, they uncovered more proof of the atrocities committed by Robert Pickton. The once ignored farm had become a focal point of national horror. Robert Pickton's methods for luring and killing his victims were chillingly calculated, yet also, pretty opportunistic. He often targeted women from the downtown Eastside. These women were vulnerable due to drug addiction, poverty, and their involvement in sex work. Pickton would approach them, offering them money, drugs, or a ride. Sometimes he promised them a party at his farm. Piggy's Palace, the party site on his property, was a known destination for some. He used his seemingly harmless, albeit scruffy demeanor to gain their trust. Once they agreed to go with him, they were taken to his isolated farm. On the farm, far from help, the women were at Pickton's mercy. The exact details of what happened to each victim may never be fully known. However, evidence suggested he would overpower them. He sometimes used handcuffs. He would then murder them. The methods of murder varied. Some victims were shot. Others may have been stabbed or strangled. The farm provided a secluded environment where such acts could occur without immediate detection. The noise and chaos of the parties at Piggy's Palace might have also provided cover for his actions. The disposal of the bodies was particularly horrific and methodical. Pickton used his knowledge as a pig farmer and butcher. He dismembered his victims. Some remains were buried on the vast property. Others were found in freezers or other locations. The most gruesome allegation, supported by some evidence and honestly his own words, was that he fed human remains to his pigs. This would have effectively destroyed much of the evidence. He also rendered down some remains, a process of boiling bodies to separate fat and bone. These methods showed a disturbing level of depravity and a clear intent to hide his crimes. Pickton's farm was not just a place of murder, but a factory for the disposal of human life. He had the tools, the space, and the lack of oversight to carry out these terrible acts for years. The clutter and disarray of the farm helped to conceal body parts and other evidence. He seemed to feel invincible, operating in plain sight, yet hidden by the marginalization of his victims and the disrepair of his surroundings. The truth of his methods revealed a profound disregard for human dignity, turning his farm into a place of unimaginable terror for the women he brought there. The forensic investigation at the Pickton farm eventually uncovered the DNA of 33 different women. These women were all on the list of those missing from the downtown East Side. This was a staggering number. It confirmed the worst fears of the families and advocates who had been raising alarms for years. However, the actual number of women Pickton killed may have been even higher than last year. Pickton himself bragged about killing more. Never changed. The condition of the remains and the methods of disposal made it very difficult to identify all potential victims. Some families may never know for sure what happened to their loved ones. Robert Pickton was eventually charged with the murders of 26 women. For legal reasons, the prosecution proceeded with charges for 6 murders in his first trial: Serena Abbotsway, Mona Wilson, Andrea Josbury, Brenda Ann Wolfe, Georgina Faith Papin, and Marnie Frey. These were the cases where the Crown felt they had the strongest evidence for conviction. The sheer volume of evidence for all 26 charges would have made for an incredibly long and complex trial. The decision was made to focus on these 6 to secure a conviction. During the investigation, after his arrest, Pickton shared a jail cell with an undercover police officer. The officer posed as an inmate, Their conversations were secretly recorded alike. In these recordings, Pickton made several incriminating statements. He reportedly told the undercover officer that he had killed 49 women. He said he had wanted to make it and even 50. He expressed disappointment that he had been caught before reaching his goal. He also described himself as being sloppy in his methods, which led to his arrest. These chilling and honestly seemingly boastful confessions provided a glimpse into his mindset. The confirmed victims were women from diverse backgrounds, though many shared experiences of hardship. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends. They had names and stories. The focus on the gruesome details of Pickton's crimes sometimes overshadowed the lives of the women he murdered. They were individuals who deserved safety and justice. The number of victims linked to Pickton made him one of Canada's most prolific serial killers. The partial remains found for many meant that families could not even have a complete body to bury, adding to their profound grief. Perfect. The Robert Pickton case exposed deep flaws in the way society and the police responded to the disappearance of marginalized women. For years, the families of the missing women and community advocates tried to sound the alarm. They insisted that a serial killer was targeting women in the downtown Eastside. Their cries were often met with skepticism or indifference. The victims were frequently dismissed because they were sex workers, drug users, or indigenous. This prejudice contributed to the slow and inadequate response from authorities. It was a systemic failure that had devastating consequences. Police forces, both the Vancouver Police Department and the RCMP, made significant errors. There was a lack of coordination between the two police forces in the early stages. Information was not always shared effectively. Early tips and warnings about Pickton were not thoroughly investigated. The 1997 attempted murder charge against Pickton, which was dropped, represented a huge missed opportunity to stop him. If he had been convicted then, many lives could have been saved. There was a failure to recognize the pattern of disappearances early on and to dedicate sufficient resources to the investigation. The official inquiry into the Pickton case, led by Commissioner Wally Oppel, later confirmed these failures. The inquiry's report, titled Forsaken, detailed the systemic bias against poor Indigenous women. It found that police indifference and flawed investigations allowed Pickton to continue his crimes for so long. The report highlighted that the victims were forsaken by society long before they were murdered by Pickton. These women were not valued, and their safety was not prioritized. The report made numerous recommendations for changes in policing and social services. The communities most affected, particularly Indigenous communities and residents of the downtown Eastside, felt betrayed. They had known for years that something terrible was happening. They had provided information and pleaded for help, yet they were not listened to. The trust between these communities and the police was severely damaged. The Pickton case became a symbol of a larger problem of violence against vulnerable women in Canada. It underscored the urgent need for systemic changes to protect those on the margins of society and to ensure that every missing persons case is treated with the seriousness it deserves. The horrific details of the Robert Pickton case sent shockwaves across Canada. The country was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about violence against women, particularly Indigenous women and those living in poverty. The sheer scale of Pickton's crimes and the fact that he was able to operate for so long was deeply disturbing. It led to widespread public outrage and grief. Canadians mourned the lost lives and questioned how such atrocities could happen in their country. The case dominated headlines for years, from the farm search to the trial and the subsequent inquiry. One of the most significant impacts of the case was the increased awareness of the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Pickton's victims included many Indigenous women. Their disappearances highlighted a national crisis that had long been ignored. The case added momentum to calls for a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which was eventually launched. It forced a conversation about systemic racism and sexism within Canadian institutions, including police forces. People began to understand that the Pickton case was not their isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of violence and neglect. In response to the Pickton case and the Oppel inquiry, some changes were made to policing practices in British Columbia and other parts of Canada. There were efforts to improve communication between police forces. New protocols were developed for handling missing persons cases, especially those involving vulnerable individuals. there was a greater emphasis on community policing and building trust with marginalized communities. However, many advocates argue that much more needs to be done. The deep-rooted issues of poverty, addiction, and discrimination that made these women vulnerable still persist. The legacy of the Pickton case is a somber one. It serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of indifference and systemic failure. It taught Canada painful lessons about the importance of listening to marginalized voices. It underscored the need to protect all members of society, regardless of their circumstances. While the case brought some measure of justice for some of the victims' families, the pain and loss remain. The hope is that the lessons learned will prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. The names of Robert Pickton's victims must not be forgotten, and the fight for a safer, more just society must continue.